developing, say, a region or a sector. So for oil and gas in that region, you would have an oil and gas environmental assessment to see what level of development you would want of oil and gas, for how long, and when you would say monitor it and reevaluate that development. You can also have them regionally, say, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but one region and look what you want that future to look like on my island. Why that's different is that we often treat environmental impact assessments as data. We don't have enough data. We have sufficient information to make the decision that this is significant and this is not. So it's sort of looked as that we don't, if we had more technical knowledge, we can make the decision. And that often can create these problems. Not that the science is crucial and key, but a lot of these concerns are actually about how do you want to proceed in the future? What do you want your future to look like? And that's a question more that's political, it's strategic in nature, and it requires a community or a regional or a political level discussion. What do you want to see? So this is something that's being proposed right now at the federal level to do with lands that they are impacted by. And it's also happening all over the world, strategic level assessment. So Canada's a little late on the boat on this one. So I'm going to show you kind of one example of one. Did you hit the next slide for me? Another beautiful map. I'm just giving you guys so many maps today. But this is the Mackenzie Valley Gas Project, which is sort of a strategic level concept. Some of you may remember the Berger report from the 1970s, where Thomas Berger went up and to evaluate whether or not the development of that region would be beneficial for their community. It was a really exciting, for me, historic event that changed how environmental assessments perceived in some ways in Canada. It was the benchmark. And so this region, and he said no, but maybe in the future. But maybe in the future they'll be ready. So about 30 years after that came the Mackenzie Valley Gas Project. And so because there was this high level of standard to start, they took a really innovative approach to the assessment. There's lots of examples I could take, but I think this one's kind of interesting. So with the Mackenzie Valley Gas Project, they looked at the project and they said the pipeline had this very large capacity, but they were only planning on piping half the volume of the capacity of the pipeline, if that makes sense. So the 1.6 cubic million, whatever, I can't remember the measure, but it's a very large amount. But they realized that since they're only planning on piping half of that, they would have the ability to pipe much, much more if they so desired. So which was what we call induced development, when you have the infrastructure and the capacity to actually create more development. So what these very brilliant people did was they decided, well, what would it look like if they piped the full capacity of that pipeline? It would look like this. So these are pipelines and gas wells all over the valley, where you have caribou, you have a very traditional population. And what the results was the gas project could be really beneficial, but not at that full capacity. If you make a pipeline that's smaller to actually pipe the amount you're talking about piping, which was like 0.8 cubic, whatever it was, then it would be really beneficial for the community. It would have a longer term life for the gas project, which is something we really want to do. We want to extend the life of mining projects, because then you can have greater economic development. You have less of an opportunity for a bust. You don't want somebody to come in, grab ore for 4 years, and skedaddle, right? Because that doesn't have many benefits long term for a community. Doesn't have many benefits long term for the government. Doesn't have many benefits even long term for ecologically, right? If you have a longer term yield, it has many more benefits. So they said, yes, but. Yes, but. We think it's a good idea, but lower level. Project never ended up going through because 2008, gas prices, mineral prices, the volatility of this market. But it established another benchmark for this region. So if they come back and they say, we want to do this gas project, that they can go back to where they were and say, is this still a reasonable expectation? Next slide. So I made up in my island how we could, from a sustainability strategic based assessment, potentially what it could look like. So what you would do is you would gather the community together. It's a very broad way of saying that, it would take 2 or 3 years to come to this. But you would create criteria to say, what do we want the future to look like? And people on the island said, this is again in my community, that we do want industrial development. We do want mines. We want those jobs. The average Canadian miner makes $110,000 a year. It's a very, very lucrative profession. So they wanted that kind of income in the community, but they didn't necessarily want to make the island have a lot more people living on it. They didn't want a boom town scenario. They also wanted the mines to try and last longer. So in this proposal, it was requested that the mines have a longer term yield, so their processor might have been slower or something like that. They also wanted to maintain this region to protect endangered species and their sacred sites. So they petitioned to have a biosphere reserve made. This happens quite a bit. So it's a challenging designation to get, but it allows people who use traditional practices to continue to use traditional practices, but for the rest of the area is protected. And they wanted to diversify economically, and tourism was an area that they thought would be a beneficial way. So they put this beautiful hotel up. And it's a very, very common approach when you're looking at economic diversification. A lot of indigenous communities really want to see tourism development, which is why I threw it in. And because they didn't want the airport, expanded the dock. That was one way they could have gone. That was the future that in this very short, on my beautiful island, that was presented. But these are actually examples of all things that have happened in Canada. Voisey's Bay, they didn't want to have an airport at a huge extent, and they didn't want the mine to leave after 7 years, which was the proposal. So they actually had it so that they could only freight the ore every 6 times a year, and they had to make the processor smaller and create a longer term lifespan for that mine. And what happened with that mine, interestingly enough, is technology's improved, and they were actually able to continue to expand the life of that mine. So these sort of things actually do happen. They're not just in my made up world. Next slide. So, on to my actual work, which I'll keep pretty brief. So this is a strategic environmental assessment I'm working on for Parks Canada on Wood Buffalo National Park. Wood Buffalo National Park is, as you can see, the largest national park in Canada. It is in northern Alberta. It straddles onto the Northwest Territories. There's some really exemplary things about this park, including that it's one of the only places that whipping crane actually breed in the whole world. Additionally, it has a population of bison and wolves that have killed each other and run away for a really long time. And they also have this thing called the Peace Athabasca Delta, which is anybody who's interested in hydrology should go in and read about the Peace Athabasca Delta, because it is super fascinating. Basically what happens is the water from the Peace River comes up into the delta, as does the Athabasca, but the flow is smaller. And it fills the delta, but one of the ways it fills the delta is at about this point here, there's an ice jam. And so with the ice jam, the ice builds up, and then under the pressure of the flow of the water, as well as heat, from just thermal heat as the area warms up, the ice breaks, and from the force of the water, the ice is pushed onto the land, which expands the physical breadth of the delta. It's a pretty majestic thing to actually see. They call it the magic. They call it the magic, which I think is pretty cool. Those hydrologists are pretty neat guys. The magic. So what's happened is the magic's not happening anymore. We have, in 1968, we call it the Wacky Bennett Dam, because it was this dam that was built in 1968. It's huge, 10th largest dam in the world, Earthville Dam, was built. And it changed the entire flow of the Peace River. preventing the ice jams from happening. They've had some ice jams from modifying the flow, but because of how electricity works, it totally changed the actual flow of the river. So the delta got a lot smaller. When the delta gets smaller, you get fewer muskrat, fewer migratory birds, changing in the water chemistry, all these things. Simultaneously, there's Fort McMurray. You have the oil sands, and you have water effluents, water withdrawal, and air pollution. So it's actually much hotter over Wood Buffalo National Park. Climate changes happen faster than in other places in Canada. So you have all these factors combining to create a huge amount of pressure on this park. So what happened was UNESCO, because it's the UNESCO World Heritage Site, said, this isn't good. And the Mikisew Cree, who are dependent on this region for their traditional economy, petitioned UNESCO and said, this is really bad. So UNESCO has required Parks Canada to have an environmental assessment. Here's what I'm working on. Why this is challenging is that it's much easier to do an environmental assessment before you actually develop. Doing it after you've developed and trying to figure out what further development is going to happen and how it's going to impact it, like the Tech Frontier mine, which is very close to the park, for example, creates some complications in my life, but also primarily for the park. Not all just about me, obviously. So that's what we are working on right now.